Okay, in this lesson, we're kind of going to expound upon our previous lesson on the reforming spirit, but we're going to focus entirely on abolition. All right? Because remember, Thomas Jefferson said that all men are created equal, right? All men are created equal. But not enslaved African Americans. No, 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 right? In fact, in 1776, it should have been written, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all white men are created equal, because we're certainly not talking about women or natives or slaves. But in the 1800s, as we've already said, that reforming spirit begins to really inspire people to start thinking differently. The first group, and we've talked about this all the way at the beginning of the school year, the Quakers. The Quakers believed that it was a sin for one human being to own another. Right? It is a sin. All right? And the Quakers, again, were persecuted for their beliefs. Many of them were driven out of England. That's why they settled in Pennsylvania. And the other thing is that Second Great Awakening, which we already talked about, that the idea of predestination. Maybe we need to rethink this. Need to think about free will. In other words, it has religious connotations about God. Did God select people who are going to be His favorites and who weren't? Really, though, we start to think about the idea of, did God institute the institution of slavery, or did man institute slavery? Well, obviously, man did. So if man started slavery, man can end slavery. At the beginning of our country, though, slavery was legal, in all the 13 original states. But by 1800, slavery in the North really begins to die out. In 1804, all of the states from Pennsylvania through all of New England had basically banned slavery. Still there were 50,000 slaves in the North in 1800, but we're talking in the South, there's millions of slaves in the South. So even though there's still a little bit of slavery that's occurring in the North, by far, in a way, the greatest extent of slavery is in the South. But there's a lot of people like, well, okay, now, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with all these African Americans? Remember again, that idea of slavery is catching on as it's a sin. But that doesn't mean necessarily that we want African Americans in the country in the 1800s. They certainly were not treated equally. Even free African Americans were not treated equally. So what are we going to do with them? Well, let's talk about the American Colonization Society. Okay, these people proposed, hey, let's just round them all up and ship them back to Africa. This idea really catches on under the presidency of James Monroe. Remember, he's the guy with the arrow of good feeling. And they proposed setting up an independent colony in Africa for freed slaves. So President Monroe, thinking he's doing a good thing, helped set up the country of Liberia, which is like right over here. Okay? And the capital of Liberia is called Monrovia, named after James Monroe. Monrovia. It's the only capital named after an American president. But this is going to turn into, not the greatest system. By the way, the flag of Liberia looks identical to the American flag, except it has one big star in the blue field, where we have, today we have 50 stars, but it still has a 13, red and white stripes, and it has a big blue field, but with one star in it. All right, now think about this. We've talked about a lot of these African Americans been denied an education, right? They don't understand how government works or how to set up municipalities, so sending these people back without the proper training is going to lead to a lot of problems for the country of Liberia. All right? And again, it's a way to just, deal with the African American problem. Let's end slaves. Let's end slavery. But we don't necessarily want them in our country. So we're going to set up, this society, the American Colonization Society, which set up the present country of Liberia in Africa. Well, one other thing I want to mention is, are these people from Africa? Now their heritage, their origin might be Africa, but these people have been born in the United States. They speak English. It'd be like, I have German in me. That's my heritage. if they were to send me back to Germany, even though I did live there for 3 years, I shouldn't, this is maybe not a great example, but I would struggle with the language, the culture, the different things of Europe. So taking these poor African Americans, and that's what they are, African Americans, and shipping them back to Africa is going to be difficult for them. Okay, let's talk about abolitionists. Abolitionists are people that want to end slavery completely. But we actually have to divide this group into two parts. You have the abolitionist who wants to end slavery right now. End it now. And then you have this other group, more of a moderate group, that says, let's make sure that slavery doesn't expand. Keep it where it's at, and eventually slavery is going to die out. If they can't get more land, remember I told you about how the cotton really kind of decimates the fields. Maybe slavery will die out. And if you think about it, guys, slaves are expensive. Slavery, having slaves is expensive. And with the advent of technology that they hope is going to occur, which does happen, they feel that maybe the need for slaves would die out. So you see this two groups. The one that says let's end slavery right now. And the other group that says don't let it expand and slavery will die out on its own. All right? So they use a lot of tools to spread their message. One's going to be lawsuits. They're going to sue to end slavery, petitions. They're certainly going to use the newspapers. And the newspapers are the medium that they're going to spread their word to all the other people, get their message across in hopes to, turn the public opinion in their favor. And, of course, speeches. Now, freed African Americans, along with some white folks, are really going to lead this movement. The most famous of them all, though, is a African American who had been born in slavery in Maryland. His name is Frederick Douglass. There he is, right there, Frederick Douglass. Okay, he had learned to read, which is against the slave code. Remember, I told you it is illegal for a slave to learn to read or write. But not only did Frederick Douglass learn to read and write, he was a master orator. He could give wonderful speeches and great writing. Now, Frederick Douglass had actually escaped. He escaped up to, I think it's Massachusetts, I believe. And he had escaped. He should have kept a low profile if he wants to keep his escape free. But he had been attending abolitionist movements, and he has moved to speak out. And now his name is well known throughout the country, including the South. And the South said, hey, that's my slave. I want him back. So Frederick Douglass actually has to go to England for a while, and a group of abolitionists in the North actually raised the money to buy him from the slave master in the South, in Maryland. So they pay for his freedom. He's able to return from England, where, of course, they give him his freedom. But there for a while, Frederick Douglass, who had been lecturing all over the North, was a runaway slave. He could have been captured and sent back. So to make sure that he is going to be able to stay free and to stay, a vital player in this movement, they're actually going to have to purchase him. White people actually have to purchase Frederick Douglass from his slave owner and then grant him his freedom. And he lectures all across the United States. He becomes an absolute wonderful leader. His speeches are moving. His writings are wonderful, and many people begin to see the evils of slavery. He begins to write. He starts to write for a newspaper called the North Star. Now, if you think about it, the North Star, that is a perfect name for an abolitionist paper, because many people, runaway slaves, would look and follow the North Star to freedom. Remember, that's the only star that does not move at night, so they can use that as a compass to guide them to freedom. So his writings, his lectures, are going to do quite a bit to help turn public opinion toward, the abolitionist movement. Now, the most outspoken and well-known white abolitionist is a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. Man, this guy is fired up. He is by far the most outspoken white abolitionist. He has the most popular anti-slavery paper called The Liberator. All right? And he is, let me read a quote real quick, okay? So in his very first newspaper, in the first article or first issue, he says, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Okay, so he is absolutely opposed to slavery, and he is probably the most well-known besides Frederick Douglass. And by the way, Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison become very good friends. All right? Now, let's talk about these fine-looking young ladies, the Grimke sisters. Woohoo! All right? Now, the Grimke sisters add a lot of, credibility to the argument. And the reason for this is because they are the daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder. They see what's going on. They have lived it, and they hate slavery. They hated slavery. They moved to Philadelphia, and they speak out against it. And what's interesting about the Grimke sisters is oftentimes they're actually like, hey, sit down. You're a woman. You can't speak. Even other abolitionist men are like sometimes opposed to the Grimke sisters speaking out. But they say, hey, if it is wrong, it is wrong. We don't care if a man says it or a woman says it. It needs to be said. So they bring a lot of credence and a lot of credibility to this argument because they know what they're speaking about because they have seen it. Okay, so let's now talk about the Underground Railroad. All of you have heard of the Underground Railroad. First of all, it's really not a railroad, okay? It's a network of blacks and white abolitionists who secretly helped these slaves escape, all right? So what happens is, and there were people that would actually risk their lives, risk their freedom to help these poor enslaved people. What they do is they have what was called conductors. And they guided these runaway slaves from place to place, often called stations. So the conductors are the freed, white people or the free African Americans who guided the runaways to stations. Now these stations could be anything. It could be a home, it could be a church, it could be a barn, it could be any place where they could go and spend a night or two. They're not going to be there very long because once these people escape, the manhunt is on to retrieve them. So they're constantly moving. And they're hoping to get them to the north. But better yet, hoping to get them to Canada. If you can get to Canada, you are truly free. If you get to the north, you're not in slavery, but you still legally belong to that slave master who could come up to the north and claim you as their property. So getting across the Ohio River into the north might be safe, better than being in slavery. Is still not entirely safe. Ideally, get to Canada because Canada has outlawed slavery, and a white Southerner cannot go up to Canada and legally get their slaves back. All right. The most famous conductor of all is Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is just a little tiny woman. Okay, she'd escaped from slavery, and she'd made it. But she can't just forget about the people she's left behind. She can't forget about her parents and her family and her friends. So she risked her freedom and her life by returning to the South 19 times. She leads more than 300 former slaves to freedom. Can you imagine the first time she escaped? Oh my God, by the grace of God I made it. But I can't stay. She goes back, gets some more, returns again. And she does this repeatedly, 19 times, saves over 300 slaves. The Southerners put a $40,000 bounty on her. Can you imagine? $40,000 today is probably millions. What would they have done to her if they'd have caught her? Oh my gosh, I can only cringe to think about what they'd have done to Harriet Tubman if they had caught her. But talk about bravery. I mean, that is bravery. And that's putting your words into actions. All right, that is true hero right there. Here is a map of some of the routes you will see right here. Let's talk about right here. Okay, Missouri's a slave state. Man, they came really close up here to Nebraska. In fact, that line should extend a little bit further up. Nebraska City actually had a station where some runaway slaves could get to. All right. You will notice that some people are trying to get down to Mexico. Some people might be trying to get into ships off the Florida coast. Remember, the Negro Fort, which is right up here, is gone. So there's no chance to find freedom in Florida. If you get to Florida, you got to keep going because Florida's a slave state. And you'll see that they're all trying to find their way north. And obviously, the further north you can get, especially in New England, that's where the hotbed of the abolitionist movement is, the safer you're going to be. But ideally, you want to get to Canada, okay, because that's where you will be most safe. All right? Now, believe it or not, you're going to see some reactions that may surprise you. In the north, some northern businessmen are like, hey, quit messing with this, all right? Because they have become dependent on southern cotton. And, whoops, I need to change colors here. On southern cotton. And they thought that this is going to mess it up. If we don't have slaves, if slavery ends, it's going to be tougher to get cotton, and it might screw up their livelihood, all right? And some feared, again, and many people in the North fear this, is that now these runaway slaves are going to go and take American jobs, right? They don't want these people up there working in the factories, working, taking away the jobs that white people need. Even immigrants are like, oh my gosh, what are they going to do? Are they, am I going to lose my chance of finding a job? So some of the reaction in the North, these abolitionists are, it's growing in support, but there are still many people that are opposed to it, even in the North, because they think it's going to threaten their pocketbook, their way to make money. All right, and in the South, as you might well imagine, they accuse the abolitionists of preaching violence, insurrection, right? Slave owners defended slavery even more. The more they're attacked about slavery, the Southerner tends to defend the practice even more. And they say that slavery is essential to the Southern economy, and they are not going to give this system up. I mean, they're not going to go one day, hey, I just read an abolitionist newspaper, and boy, they're right. I'm going to free all my slaves. That's not going to happen. And again, it's probably going to lead to war. Slavery probably is not, unfortunate as it may sound, the South is dug in. They are not listening to reason, and it's going to lead to bloodshed before this practice of slavery is finally blotted off our nation. All right, there you go. So that's some of the background on the abolitionist movement.